it's my great pleasure to welcome you here for this session on Decolonising museum training and university courses in Aotearoa. So we've got a panel set up here of some of the university courses. We were to have been joined by a colleague from EIT, and that course at the moment is undergoing review. So unfortunately, currently we don't have anybody representing that course here on the panel, but in the future that course might get underway. Philip has just asked me to give you a few housekeeping tips. Lost property, quite a few items have been left in Oceania, including keys, clothing, glasses and a packet of fags. So if anybody's dying for Benson and Hedges, that's where you left them. There are some sponsors out there in Oceania doing demonstrations. Please visit them, and you can win a bottle of Atarangi Pinot Noir from New Zealand Micrographic Services purely by putting your business card into the glass bowl. There are also games and interactives for museums around the Tuia 250th commemoration that might interest you, and there's a 3D scanning demonstration on as well. We have a big thank you to give to Toulouse for sponsoring tonight's party, which starts at the New Zealand Portrait Gallery, hosted by Janine Parkinson, a graduate from the University of Auckland, at 5 p.m. And you can get there earlier if you wish to view the exhibition. There'll be 2 free drinks and nibbles available if you're registered, and then after that there'll be a cash bar and food available to purchase. So the theme for this morning's session, we're looking very much at the kind of complexion of what courses might be available in New Zealand and how they address the kaupapa of the conference, particularly looking at decolonising museums and how we prepare our graduates for that. I can remember being an expert witness at the personal grievance hearing of a friend of mine in Dunedin some years ago, and before he demolished my reputation entirely, the counsel for the employer, which was a gallery, immediately said to me, well, you have no museum qualifications. And I thought, what? I've worked in museums for 30 years, but that counted for nothing because I had no actual museum qualification. So that kind of situation now has completely changed, and it's largely due to the considerable effort and development of particular individuals in the sector setting up courses and developing them. And I think I've calculated that combined we have 269 years of experience on the panel and to offer you. So we're going to share some of our insights into teaching in this area. And of course the lead institution that has had a museum studies program running for the longest time is Massey University, and some of you may have undertaken those programs. So I'd just like you to join with me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Susan Abasa to talk about her work at Massey University. Please welcome Susan.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Linda, thank you for the introductions. I'm not so sure I'm quite so enamoured of the questions you set us for an essay. So I'm going to try and address at least one of the things that you gave us for homework, which is how does the Museum Studies program at Massey operate to address its bicultural responsibilities. I need also to acknowledge that there are some graduates of the program and current students in the audience. Tēnā koe. On the screen you'll see what is basically a roadmap of how the Museum Studies program is constructed. It's been operating, as Linda inferred, since 1989. I've been there for a good part of that, thankfully not entirely for 30 years. Our sort of key offering, if you like, is the postgraduate diploma in museum studies. It has 4 courses. Within that is the course Taonga Tuku Iho, which is the only compulsory paper, and there are various ways of constructing the PG DIP to meet students' and career objectives. It's a discrete qualification in its own right, but it's also a foundation for other qualifications, including the Masters, and depending on which pathway you take in the Masters, whether it's a research pathway or professional pathway to the PhD. We now offer 4 different sorts of Masters programs. Tēnā koe, David. One is a, probably I think the only 240 credit Masters, so PG Dip papers plus a 120 credit thesis. We also have a 90 credit thesis, which is slightly shorter and is generally combined with 3 700 level courses from the PG Dip. This information, of course, is available on the website if anyone wants to follow up, or please come and see me if you need further details. The MA Professional has been operating as an advanced research practicum, I think really from the get-go, and is, as it suggests, an intensive internship, the equivalent of 2 semesters, 1 semester full-time, 2 semesters part-time, plus a research report. But the university has also instigated, to match other universities some years ago, 180 credit masters, which means the 4 PG Dip papers, plus a 60-point research report or an advanced research practicum. The beauty about all of this is you can mix and match, you can stop and start. Preferably once you start a particular qualification, you try and finish it, though some people do suspend for a little while and then return. Some of you may know that my second initial is F. That's for flexibility, in case you thought of something else. To continue the flexibility theme, people can enrol in February or they can enrol in July. Prior warning is a good idea. Our current cohort of students this semester is totaling an extraordinary figure for museum studies, massive, 40%. We generally average about 25 to 30% Maori roll. Assessments for anyone contemplating this avenue of study is also available for submission in Te Reo. We have very few full-time students, 3 or 4 a year. The majority of our students are part-time with very complicated lives. About 55% of those, sometimes slightly more, are practitioners, some of them at senior level. So one of the features of the Massey program is I think it's the only distance program, which means 24/7 availability of everything, including, unfortunately, me. So I get slightly grumpy in the middle of the night, but that's a small factor, which can be sort of circumvented with a bit more sleep. One of the issues that we face is that because of complicated lives and, unfortunately, a very growing incidence of, I would call, social and economic issues, the incidence of major life-changing forces is becoming quite a concern. And I'm referring here to very serious violence and unfortunately growing incidence of younger suicide attempts. That unfortunately affects a lot of our Maori and Pacifica students disproportionately. So one of the things that we attempt to do is, again, using the flexibility word, to try and meet those students and help them manage very, very awkward situations. Luckily, Massey is attuned to this, and Museum Studies is a small program, so we manage, I think, reasonably well. The question most people ask of us is, at what stage do people do practicums? Given that our people are in New Zealand spread this year from Invercargill to Kerikeri, and we have 5 students located in Australia and 1 in Japan. It makes it somewhat harder for them to join us for practicums. But we do run workshops from time to time, usually in the semester breaks, and we join other museums to undertake short-term 3 or 4 day workshops. And some of you who are part of the Auckland program will be part of a cohort working with Auckland Museum in a couple of weeks' time, rehousing the Barry Mackay negative collection. I thought I would, oops, going too fast. Red one seems to be doing its thing. There we go. I want to talk primarily about one of our courses called Taonga Tuku Iho. It's a compulsory course. It is, in every sense, the foundation of the program. It doesn't mean it has to be done first. But the genesis of that particular course lies with the foundation of the program and its original kaupapa, which was shaped by Maina Mackenzie of Ngāti Hoiti and the indefatigable director of the Manawatu Museum. David Butts, who's here in the audience, was the founding director of museum studies. And after about 10 years, although there had been strong Māori involvement in the teaching program, which at that stage was both distance and smaller internal class, the people associated with the program, including Julie Catchpole, who's also here in the audience, Tēnā koe Julie, got together and with museum associates came to grips with the questions around how could that Māori involvement be more focused, and what were the key issues facing museum training and museums in New Zealand. So that initiative developed into the baseline for the current offerings. The development of the course began with inquiries to the then head of the School of Māori Studies, Professor Mason Dury. He and his staff then worked with David to construct a team-taught course of the same name. It also happened to coincide with the movement of museum studies into the School of Māori Studies. That made it quite unique, not only in terms of New Zealand, but internationally as well. David, for some reason, decided he would resign, and that was in 2009, and went to other opportunities. That left not only a vacuum, but by then the program had moved to the School of People, Environment and Planning. There was quite a lot to do in that changeover period, one of which was to examine all of the course content and see what needed changing. So a very large overhaul of Taonga Tuku Iho took place a couple of years later, again with the staff of Māori Studies, by then slightly different composition from the original program. And it also coincided with the development of distance learning electronically rather than by paper-based teaching methods. So it was an opportune moment. The literature had changed dramatically. Case studies were available. We could host filmed documentaries and so on desktop. The arrangements with the School of Māori Studies persisted in terms of team teaching and coordination of this particular course for some years. Over the last 3 years, there have been several shifts within the School of Māori Studies. The Māori Visual Arts program has been located to Koka, Massey Wellington College of Creative Arts, where Huhana Smith is now head of program there. So some of those arrangements are still quite fluid between museum studies and that program, but there is still a very close relationship, and staff still do teach into the program. And we are trying to establish a slightly different set of relationships, both with that school and with other providers. We also rely on our senior alumni, some of whom are in the last stages of doctoral research, and on a number of our colleagues now in the museum sector. So quite simply, Taonga Tuku Iho is the foundation for all of the other programs. Those key words from the treaty and from Y262, Mataranga Māori, Kaitiakitanga, Taonga and Rangatiratanga, Manatonga, Taonga Tuturu, are then explored in the three other courses that we offer. For collection management, for instance, how is a Western perspective on preventive conservation framed and mediated by cultural integrity? How is Mataranga Māori, how much is Mataranga Māori needing protection for the push for total access to taonga, and why that's okay? And because we now teach a dedicated 4-week module, slightly longer, on Vernon CMS, and are gradually cataloguing the Massey art and heritage collections, there's scope, as one of our alumni once said, Annie Mary White, to max out Vernon. But without an agreed nomenclature for Taonga Māori, how do we succeed? For museum management, Rangatiratanga, as the Y262 report suggests, is a pragmatic nuancing of treaty issues that guarantees 3 levels of protection: full decision-making powers, partnership with the Crown, influence through consultation. But how does that actually apply in practice for council-administrated and operated museums? And for public programs, kaitiakitanga, of one of the words that infiltrates and is the foundation for that program, public programs. How do museums overseas interpret Taonga Māori? Do they interpret it? And Mataranga Māori, how does it apply to interpretations that will form Tuia 250? And how will this inform development, for instance, of a project that we did last year with the students, the storyboards for digital exhibitions? And now, because time is slipping away, I just want to raise a couple of other questions. And these all apply to the things that are daily in my mind and in our students' minds. So how does museum studies at Massey develop tikanga for its teaching spaces, digital, physical, as well as on 3 different campuses that refer to different mana whenua? How do we practice the duty of care, which is manaakitanga, to protect, value and respect our whānau while they struggle with competing priorities, let alone the accumulated debts that mount up when studying at postgraduate level? And I could go on. Last night I received an email, fairly late, from one of our students who's about to finish the PG dip and come to Masters, just having been appointed as curator at the Jewish Museum in Melbourne. And briefly, you can read it for yourselves, but she said, personally, I think that Taonga Tuku Iho, this paper I mentioned first, has really added great depth to my understanding of museums in Aotearoa. The responsibility to work with Māori, to encourage development of Māori working in the sector, and to better understanding of New Zealand's legislation around Taonga Turu. This progress can only continue if universities are able to produce brave practitioners who are willing to test new ways of doing things, or simply have the confidence to take the first steps in opening up a relationship with local iwi. Just before I finish, I just want to steer back to something from Ko Aotearoa Tene. In that report, it emphasises that the treaty is developing into a 21st century relationship of mutual advantage through joint action. Both treaty partners end up better off than they were before they started. That is the Treaty of Waitangi beyond grievance. There is therefore a great deal more that Museum Studies at Massey can and must do to ready our graduates for the challenges that lie ahead in the post-treaty settlement phase of cultural restitution, working in iwi-centred organisations, and most of all, helping to keep the promise made in 1840. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Susan. For those that came in late, there is not a speaker here from Te Ara Porewa, which was the course set up at EIT. That course is under review at the moment, and the format for this morning is that each of the representatives from the different universities are going to be talking about their courses and how they address the kaupapa for this conference, specifically looking at preparing graduates for a decolonised museum of the future. So the next speaker this morning is my colleague at the University of Auckland, Dr. Ngarino Ellis. I think Ngarino is the first Māori to be the head of an art history department in New Zealand, and of course she was the winner of the Judith Binney Prize for her first book at the Ockham Book Awards in 2017, and she's currently in the second round for her second Marsden Grant, third Marsden Grant. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Ngarino Ellis.
I ngā mana ngā reo e ngā hui whā tēnā tātou katoa, ki te mana whenua, tēnā koutou, ki te papa, me rongo whakata, tēnā koutou, kia Linda Ma, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone, this is a little bit of a pitch from all of us, come to our universities. So I think so far Susan's got the highest point mark because hers is extremely slick. Mine is a little bit less so. But we'll start off with what my new thing is, which is in every PowerPoint, will this work? Show a photo of myself at school. So, I am Ngāpuhi Ngāti very proudly from both of those centres of the University of Rangitukia on East Cape and Te Rāwhiti on the easternmost settlement, which is in the Bay of Islands. I've been teaching in art history on and off for the past 20 years. I convened the Museum Studies course for the Museum Studies program for 5 years from 2012 until Linda took it over last year. Yeah, and I went on to do other things as well. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you today about was about this idea of decolonising museums and decolonising our teaching practice and by extension our students. So I teach in art history and pretty much 90% of the students in our classes are white, upper middle class females, like the ones I went to school with. So this is me in sixth form, which is year 12. I've got 3 kids, none of them can recognise who I am in this photo. I'm a twin, so that should kind of help. Westlake Girls is exactly this kind of demographic because I made sure to send both my girls to there. And so I'm in the back row, second from the left, my twin is to my right. So this is what walks into your classroom, and it's about how do you challenge or how do you transform the way that they think about who they are in advance of them coming to work, getting their hustle on into places like this. And so in my class in sixth form, it was the biggest girls' school in Auckland at that time, and it still is. There were 1,200 girls. There were 300 in my year. Of those 300, 2 of the Māori are in this picture. So think about how that makes you feel in terms of being, having your viewpoints, your perspectives in class. I had one teacher all through school who pronounced my name right. One teacher, and I was at school until the end of sixth form, being told not to leave because I was 16, but I wanted to leave anyway. So this is a program summary. The Museum Studies program was initially located within the Anthropology department, where it was had some great teachers, Paul Tapsell, Roger Nietzsche, until they left, and then they had a whole number of contract teachers. And then it moved over to art history a few years later. And then last year, unbeknownst to us, it was made a program as there was a whole restructuring within our faculty and within our School of Humanities. So we became a distinct program with 0 staff. So Linda was there as half-time, and all the rest of us were kind of teaching into the program from anthropology, Māori studies, English, history. And so we got people in from different departments who would teach specific courses which would align with museum studies. Linda's the current convener. We offer from postgraduate diploma, which is a 1-year program, through to MA. And then last year I introduced a new course, Masters of Heritage Conservation, which is less intense for a lot of students who are when they see a 120-point thesis kind of fall over and go, I can't do this. So we introduced something different where it is 45 points, which is 15,000 in the 18-month or 12-month option. We typically will have 2 core courses or 1 core course, and I teach one of those, and students have got to take 30 points of them. There are 2 new courses this year, which I'll let Linda sometime talk to you. You're going to talk about them, huh? One of them is an undergrad, so we used to be an undergrad program, and now we've come back to undergrad, HUMS 300, with 60 students, and then a new course with Liz Cotton I saw somewhere. Waving hands. Oh, you're going. Excellent. This is excellent. I'm not seeing you. Let's go. That's fine. That's fine. I'm not. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. So there are 2 new courses, which is really exciting. Thinking that we're trying to reinvigorate the program and keep it fresh for students and respond to what students need. We typically have between 10 and 20 full-time students. Of those 20, maybe 3 or 4 are international students, and that comes with its own kind of challenges because of different support systems that our university does and does not provide. And our graduates are everywhere. They're in this conference hustling, which is what you have to do when you get your degree. So I'm just going to spend the rest of my 10 minutes talking about the course that I teach, and this is Museum 704A, 705. This is part of the core course. This is a 1-semester offering. I first offered it in 2014. And at that time, when you go and prepare a course like this, I hadn't taught museum studies beforehand, so I thought I'd go to the bookshop, go to the library and have a look and see what was there. And I was looking at all of these amazing writers, and I put them in the course book. And then about the 3rd week, I suddenly realised, I thought, what am I doing? I am trying to promote the Indigenous voice, yet what my students are reading is not Indigenous. 95% of the reading, and I feel the awkward silence is now, the elephant is now in the room, 95% of what is written about us is not from us and by us. And I thought, I cannot, as a Māori academic, ignore this fact. So over the mid-semester break, I got my hustle on and went to the library, went online, because not much has been published by Native authors about museum studies, certainly not in 2014, and I completely turned the curriculum around. And so all the reading list from that time has been Native. And so all the core readings is Indigenous, and there are others who are amazing, some of whom are sitting up here, and it's really ironic that we're talking about decolonising museums in the 21st century, and look at the dynamic that's up here. I'm the only Māori up here as a permanent position. So what does that say in terms of hiring? But anyway, so I completely changed it round Students found, because they came from this background which is, we don't know any Māori, our parents don't know any Māori, where I live there are no Māori around us, I don't engage in anything Māori, I wouldn't know where to start. A lot of them, still to this day, there's quite a lot of pushback. There is the uncomfortable. A lot of them feel uncomfortable because it is going to places that they are not familiar with, but I say that it's all done in love, and it's done in the hope that they will reflect on where they are within their journey, and I do this from my stage 1 classes right up to my master's classes, and say, think about what you know. How do you know that? How can you change that? And so through the course, this is what we do. We start to read Native, we look at Native perspectives, Native frameworks, Native writers, Native curators, Native artists. And so I give them different ways in which they can engage in the Indigenous world. And so we do a whole lot of work in the classroom in terms of discussions. I'm really into making an active classroom, so we have lots of group work. We get out into the community. Ironically, the first year that I wrote the paper, 2/3 of the lectures were by community members that my university had promoted me to do this. I go to my performance review the next year, and I won't say who my boss was at that time, and they said, "You're not doing enough teaching. You need to be doing more teaching." I said, "It's a community paper, it's an Indigenous paper." No. Under the rubric that is the university, you need to be in front teaching the course. And I felt really uncomfortable as a Māori academic. And to give you some frame, within the Faculty of Arts where I am, outside of Māori studies, there are 5 Māori staff out of 300. So the dynamics in terms of being Māori in a university is still under pressure. So my question really is, and so while we've been asked to talk about decolonising museums, my question is, we can't decolonise and teach about decolonising the museums until we decolonise ourselves and flip that round and decolonise what is happening in our classrooms. Because we can't stand here like knights on a shining horse and say, this is what others do. We have to turn it into what we are thinking, what we are teaching. And what does that mean when we say we are going to decolonise? Because it's a very trendy word. We're going to decolonise this, decolonise that. But what does that actually look like? What might your classroom look like? What might your practice look like? So I'm constantly looking for new ways to invigorate my classrooms. 2 weeks ago on the website called Art History Teaching Resources, there was a new blog post. And one of them was about decolonising the classroom, and it's all very trendy. And they said this is an exercise they do, and I encourage you to think about this as one way to think about your practice. And they said, pair your students up in that first class, get them to share the story about where they've come from, where their family is in terms of New Zealand. You know how you say, I've been here 4 generations. Well, I've been here 53, and I can go back to Te Pō. But you get them to go into pairs, and then they have to present it to each other, to the class. And they said, sit back and think, how do you feel with someone else teaching about your own personal history? And what if they get it wrong? How do you feel? And that's how Native people feel. That's how we as Māori feel when others talk about our history. And just think about that as an exercise. I talk about things in terms of our workplace and things which we call microaggressions. Microaggressions are little things every day that remind you that we are still living in a very much a colonial space, certainly at tertiary institutions, and I don't think Auckland is unique there. Little microaggressions like you go into the tea room, someone's put their hat on the tea table. Little microaggressions like you go into a performance review and your boss mispronounces your name. Everyone mispronounces your name. They don't stock your stuff in the bookshop. Little things that every day remind you where you are and where Māori are certainly still in this country, and we think about who we could be encouraging our students to read. And Arapata, you're one of the top 3 things that my students will read and will reference. I'm still waiting for the book. So students will be reading Arapata. They'll be reading David as well, David Butts, because his work was pivotal in terms of laying some of those foundations, so those groundworks. So think about how you can transform your own selves in little ways, and by that extension transform your workplace and transform your students as well. And that for me is a great goal of mine. So when the students leave, they feel confident about talking about Māori, confident that they know who to read, who to reference, who to go to, how we feel, and how to remain humble within the space which is the museum. Okay, and on that note, kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Ngarino. Ngarino and I are convening the Art Association of Australia and New Zealand conference in Auckland in the first week of December this year, and there will be masterclasses, one with an Indigenous scholar in curatorial practice, just immediately preceding the conference on Tuesday the 3rd of December, so keep your eyes open for more updates about that. The next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce my old mate from the University of Canterbury, Conal McCarthy, who I think I first met in 1980 when he was fresh off the farm in Wāmaru, and who of course has now come a long way to being the professor at Victoria University and in charge of the museums program there. So Conal's published many books. You'll be aware of his scholarship and of course his book on Te Papa, which came out last year for the anniversary of the opening in 1998. So please welcome Conal McCarthy.
Kia ora mai tātou, aku hoi ngā whare wānanga, tēnā koutou. Thank you very much, Linda. I'm pleased to say I'm from Victoria University of Wellington and not the University of Wellington. Although we're rebranding apparently, so we're going to be emphasising the Wellington, so it'll be Victoria University of Wellington over the next year. Hoi anō. I'm going to, in the 10 minutes I've got, briefly describe the program at Victoria and then think out loud a little bit about this issue, thinking about decolonising museum studies as well as decolonising museums, think a little bit about what research can do, and just point to a couple of other things that have come up already in this conference. And the next session in here is about that kind of theory and practice sort of nexus with museum studies and museum professionals, so it relates partly to that as well. Victoria University program started in the 1970s as a recreation and leisure program founded by Alan Laidler. The late Michael Volkeling established museum studies in about 2000, and currently we have a 1-year taught master's degree focusing on professional practice. We have about 20 students a year doing that. On campus, no distance, and we have about 12 or 13 PhD students. We have an advisory group. There are 2 full-time staff, myself and Lee Davidson, 3 teaching fellows, consultants, Robyn Cockburn and Michael Kelly, who teach courses, a practicum course and a historic heritage conservation course, and Awhina Tamarapa, who's just started her PhD teaching the museums and Māori course. So I'll talk a little bit about teaching, learning, how they relate to professional practice, and then I want to talk a little bit about research. Just over the last week, to give you an idea of the way that I think decolonisation and related issues like indigenisation suffuse teaching and learning in museum studies and related fields like art history. In the last week, I've read an essay by a student about decolonisation and indigenisation in museums. I've had a Skype session with a young man from San Diego who wants to come to New Zealand to study because he's heard about, decolonisation efforts in this country. I've had meetings with PhD students who deal with decolonisation as part of their research. And I've been hearing about all of the kōrero at the Kaitaki Māori Hui on Monday and Tuesday, which was at Papawai Marae over in the Wairarapa, and about some of the things that will be discussed this weekend at the EMP Hui. So in a sense, decolonisation is sort of there in a lot of the things that we do. And as Ngarino and Susan have talked about, at the university sort of side of things, you know, we explore ways in which that comes into the things that we as academics do. Teaching, research, and that kind of external engagement, which I think is really difficult. In some ways, universities are very poor instruments in their service to the sector. And we have the academics sitting on the stage and the professionals sitting in the audience. And this split between theory and practice and professionals and academics is, I think, really unhelpful. And universities are locked into certain kinds of structures, like the performance-based research fund and other kinds of structures, which make it very difficult for them to serve their allied industries in terms of the way they might prepare their graduates so that they are industry ready, and also get engaged in the kinds of urgent debates that professionals in the sector are struggling with every day. So in some ways, I see the future of the training and professional development, the research, the learning, the teaching that we can be involved with as a nexus, as something which has to be integrated and synthesised. And that will probably happen, I suspect, between universities and museums in more flexible spaces between the two, sitting in one or the other, possibly sitting in the museum sector, being serviced by the university, where we can get out of things like the timetable and other kinds of structures that we're locked into that make it very difficult for us, you know, as Ngarino and Susan have showed, to privilege things like external engagement, professional practice, training, professional development, that in the university environment can be very hard things to pursue with our esteemed academic colleagues from old disciplines who tend to regard subjects like museum studies as being a little bit like the 60-pound weakling on the beach, having sand kicked in our face every day by people from erstwhile older honourable subjects. So I think that politics may be one of these spaces in which this kind of integration of theory and practice, this partnership of training and professional development can happen. I'm really disappointed that there's no one here from Te Arapauriwa at Toi Haukura. I think that was a great initiative, and I really hope that someone is hired, Derek Lardelli, to replace Michelle Horde and continue to teach that program, because to be quite honest, at Victoria we don't get many Māori and Pacifica students coming through a taught master's degree or higher research degrees. That course in the last 3 years has produced 8 to 10 Māori graduates a year who are going into the sector, and in particular they are well prepared, I think, for Māori museology, for that Māori museum sector outside mainstream museums, you know, iwi, post-settlement, setting up their own cultural centres, talking about managing their own taonga in that broader GLAM kind of space, which includes things like libraries and archives. And I think the graduates from Te Arapauriwa are well positioned for that. So we really need to get, you know, we all need to support and make sure that that course gets up and running again and produces that sort of stream of Māori graduates coming into the sector. A couple of things that have struck me, I think, in the 2 or 3 days that we've had here at the National Conference. A lot of talk about biculturalism, which in a way is kind of disappointing, because I think that, as David Butts' research and many others show, that is a paradigm, I think, from the 1980s and 90s, which is probably past its use-by date. It's the word that Pākehā, that non-Māori often use to articulate what it is they're trying to do, rather than the word that Māori themselves use in describing either the interface within mainstream museums or what they do themselves independently amongst whānau and hapu. Colonisation, I think, has the word colonisation has come up. I was really impressed with Charles Chahukaramu Royal's presentation yesterday, where he talked about the ever-present and all-embracing nature of colonisation. And we're reminded by scholars like Patrick Wolfe in the Australian context, who reminds us that colonisation is not an event. It's not something that happened and then didn't happen. It is a process which is ever present. So then we have these options now, and if you like, other words, paradigms, and perhaps rhetorical devices like decolonisation and indigenisation. And people talk about post-colonial, as if it's finished, again, that word post, or decolonising as a verb, present continuous verb, an ongoing process of decolonisation, something that's emergent and happening both within the mainstream and outside the mainstream in Te Ao Māori. And the related concepts of indigenisation. And that itself has a great degree of debate about it. In a recent book chapter, Paul Tapsell, formerly from Otago Museum and Auckland University, of course, talks about pre-Indigenous, because he regards the word indigeneity as something which itself, to a degree, has been a colonial construct. And to think beyond that means going back to a pre-Indigenous, pre-colonial state, to look at the ways in which native and tribal concepts, methods or paradigms might themselves be the basis for transforming museum practice. So just as we in the university environment are trying to decolonise, recall, revise and transform our discipline, so the task, I think, for all of us, including professionals, both Māori and non-Māori, is to recall, revise, transform museology, to think about the practices of collecting, display, education interpretation, governance, management, conferences, membership, and so on and so forth, me ratu āhuatanga katoa, and to think about how those things are colonial constructs and how they might be decolonised. And I think the particular challenge for kaitiaki Māori, for kaimahi Māori in our museums, is to think about how those practices of looking after things, showing things, public programs, community engagement and so on, may be done by using whakaaro Māori. Arapata Hakiwai's PhD thesis talks about development. It talks about how museums can be tools that support tribal, social and cultural development. So there are things happening outside museums, I think, in the regions, amongst iwi themselves, that can be supported. There are things happening within museums. And I think it's really thinking about the essential, conceptual, structural nature of the very things that we do in museums and how they can be, as poor Waikens put it yesterday, brownified or Māorified or whatever the word was that she used. So I think that's a particular challenge for kaitiaki Māori. And my last thought, I think, would be in this process of decolonisation, which really requires in-depth research, I think, both by professionals and academics and students working together to construct these new paradigms and these new pathways. I think a historical dimension is really important. I think that the way that Eloise yesterday talked about the history of the Tairawhiti Museum, David Butts and others have done this in the sector, looking at their own institutional histories and the way in which Māori have engaged with collecting, ordering, governing, exhibiting over the last 150 years, and the way that those engagements provide models for the future of how we might proceed in this country. And also how we might compare and contrast, Ngarino was talking about the big conference coming up at Waikato in June, how this might be a comparative endeavour of how Māori and non-Māori in Aotearoa may look to Australia, Canada, the US, the Pacific and other places, and learn the lessons of other people elsewhere also trying to decolonise and indigenise museums, galleries and heritage, and how we can learn from that. Ka mutu ko nei a tātou kōrero mō tēnei wā. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Conal. And our last speaker in the panel this morning has battled a head cold all the way up from Christchurch. It's Rosie Ibbotson from the University of Canterbury, who did her PhD in the History of Art program at Cambridge University in the UK. And she's now in her 7th year of teaching in New Zealand, came to these shaky isles, I think, just after the earthquakes, fortunately. And she's been in charge of the curatorial program, and that was the first given thing she was tasked with at the University of Canterbury. So please join with me in welcoming Rosie.
Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, Linda. I'd like to acknowledge the mana whenua of this area and tangata whenua katoa, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate that very sympathetic introduction. I did lose my voice quite badly earlier in the week, so I apologise in advance if I'm a bit hard to hear. And I'm also going to be reading from notes, as that's the only way I was ever going to be able to keep to my allotted time and stay on focus. So I thought I'd start by briefly outlining the scope and structure of the museum-related studies we do at Canterbury, before focusing on how the principles of Titiriti inform the museum education we provide there. And if I've got time, I'll then want to think a bit more about future directions and the ongoing work we have to do in order to be responsive to evolving understandings of Titiriti and the histories and future of Aotearoa New Zealand. So as a brief overview, at postgraduate level at Canterbury, there are two parallel programs that are or can be oriented around providing a foundation for museum work or upskilling during an existing curatorial career. These are run by the Art History Department, and prospective students interested in learning about museums at Canterbury approach us from both within and outside of the university, and sometimes having already worked within the GLAM sector. Students tend to end up on one of two largely parallel tracks for their studies, either in the honours programme, sometimes with a view to doing master's level research on a museological topic, either with us or elsewhere, or in the postgraduate diploma in art curatorship. That's the title of the programme that I inherited. Both the honours and the PG Dip programmes are 1 year of full-time study and involve studying for 4 courses. So core to both an honours pathway for those interested in museums, but who want to be able to continue their studies after that qualification, and the postgraduate diploma, which is a terminal qualification, as they call it. Core to both of these pathways is a taught paper titled Never Neutral Museums in Context. And this course frames the other courses students do as part of their studies, including through its engagement with Titiriti. And this engagement takes a number of forms. Titiriti guides both the pedagogical approach of the course, most significantly through the idea of participation. And we also think about Titiriti in terms of how the history and future of museums in Aotearoa is very much entangled with it and with the context from which it came. The course has been evolving over the years I've taught it, but a key assumption it has maintained, and this relates to one of the things Conal said, is that the history and theory of museums is central to an understanding of future curatorial practice. The course therefore emphasises how the history of museums is inextricably bound up with asymmetric power relations, colonialism and violence. And I think it's important to foreground this early on in the course, in part because it's not something that all our students are necessarily aware of when they first get interested in curatorial work. And I myself actually wish I'd had a more extensive understanding of this when I first started working in museums. This desire to give students a clear understanding of the field they are hoping to spend their careers in is, of course, not just about historical context, but seeks to set them on a path of confronting the deeply problematic foundations of museums as institutions and working towards decolonising practices of collection and display. Informed by the principles of Titiriti, this is framed as a shared responsibility and one that is most effectively addressed by way of a partnership between tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. By emphasising the idea of partnership between tangata whenua and tangata tiriti rather than just Pākehā, the course seeks to think more broadly about issues of museological inclusion and erasure. The students that have taken the course come from a range of cultural backgrounds, Māori, Pākehā, and also immigrants like myself from quite a few different places. And I think it's important that everyone engaging with museum studies in Aotearoa feels that they can personally connect to Titiriti in a contemporary way, whatever their identities. Classes based substantially on participation and discussion create a space where we can learn from each other, sometimes because of difference. And I should add that while students are often keen to talk about issues of museological inclusion and exclusion as these apply to their own identities, cultural and otherwise, it's also important to keep these particular discussions about some topics very much voluntary, as obviously, understandably, these can be personal or upsetting topics. The idea of bringing diverse perspectives together to think critically about museums is also something that guides the theoretical underpinning of the course. A lot of the post-structuralist ideas embedded in new museological texts and other relevant sources seem to draw on, perhaps unwittingly, much longer-standing concepts within indigenous thought. And one example might be some eco-critical thinkers' relatively recent questioning of the supposed divide between nature and culture, which is, of course, not a new insight in many indigenous worldviews, as evidenced, for example, by the scope of the Y262 report. So even when it is seeking to move towards inclusion and equity, there's a sense in which, quote-unquote, Western academia problematically seems to appropriate indigenous ideas. And this is something that we highlight in the course, as well as thinking about how these resonances between different traditions of thought will be key to partnering across cultures to continue the work of reforming museums. We also seek to instill in all students, a sense of responsibility for this process that they'll take forward into professional contexts. In addition to discussion-based sessions geared around readings, I've been fortunate over my time of teaching the course to have worked with a number of guest lecturers, curators, artists, and academics whose expertise in the relationship between museums and tangata whenua, and sometimes specifically mana whenua, has taught both the students and myself a lot. The knowledge of guest lecturers is critically important for expanding students' understanding of how Te Tiriti and its principles relate to museum practice. But this is not to say that these issues are confined to these sessions. As well as connecting guest speakers' ideas to discussions throughout the classes, the course's coverage of the biases within persistent Eurocentric museological conventions seeks to draw attention to how museums can misrepresent and exclude different perspectives. This process of creating space for diverse perspectives is, I think, something that everyone can do, in part by acknowledging what you don't know sometimes, and by fostering practices of listening as a strategy for decolonising museums. The conversations tangata whenua in Aotearoa and other parts of the world have led around exclusion in museums and elsewhere are, of course, key to thinking about other instances of lack of representation, discrimination and violence. Many of the conversations that have been taking place on campus and elsewhere in the wake of the recent racist atrocity that targeted Muslim tangata Tiriti in Christchurch have drawn on the principles of Te Tiriti in thinking of ways to forge solidarity and strengthen partnerships against hate. This is something that the curatorial students brought up in discussions in classes. They were all very affected by this, of course. And they recognised this idea of partnership and solidarity and its relevance for all fields, including the one they're going into. And they were keen to draw on Te Tiriti as a way of working towards all forms of inclusion. In addition to the museum theory course, the PG DIP comprises an elective taught from the Art History 400 level schedule, which I should say has unfortunately shrunk over the years. And it also has an internship at a host institution in Christchurch, and then a special project devised in consultation with the supervisor, but largely determined by the student. And we're currently in the process of revisiting and rethinking the requirements for these for a number of reasons, but in part to make considering Tiriti responsibilities a more active part of how students conduct and reflect upon their work in these projects. So that's all I'll say for now, but kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Now we're at 11:28 and we need to vacate the Soundings Theatre for Conal's colleagues, Robyn Cockburn and Lee Davidson, who are in here starting at 11:30. So can I suggest if you have questions for any of the panellists that you might want to collar them at lunchtime and talk about their courses, their ideas, and perhaps follow up on some of the material that they've presented. But for now, could you please join with me in thanking Susan Abasa, Ngarino Ellis, Conal McCarthy and Rosie Ibbotson.
Actually, that's not.
Would that make them feel awkward?
Actually, all these classes are very dangerous there.
Okay, well, yeah, there's no one sort of worrying about that.
Yeah, that's not us catering. I don't know where they are.
Thank you. Oh. Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay, still no water or anything?
No, that will be coming. We'll just have to cope with that.
Okay.
I might just...
I'm going outside to see if I can find the catering supervisor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, that's perfect. Thank you.
Right.
Are we good to go? Right, very good. Eina mana, eina reo, eina karanga maha o te wā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Robyn Cockburn tuku inga, ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou. Museum practice is dynamic and constantly evolving through the interplay between what professionals do, some of you in the audience, and what they think about what they do. In this panel of early career researchers and professionals, we'll bring you some fresh perspectives on practice through their engagement with recent theory and practice. Using a range of Indigenous, international and multidisciplinary lenses, our panel will explore ideas of participation, protection and partnership in a range of contexts. We've asked them to think about these ideas and the things that underpin the theories and the practice, and to identify areas of their own experience and the consequential impact this has on the audience and the visitor. The way we've structured this session is that Lee Davidson, on my far right, will set up a provocation or a set of questions, and our four panellists will respond to each of these in turn. We'll then summarise those and move on. So we've got 3 key questions that are going to be asked and 4 interesting answers that you will get to share. My name is Robyn Cockburn, as I said, and I'm a teaching fellow at Victoria University with responsibility for the practicum component. And for those of you who were in the previous session, you will have heard a little bit about that program from Conal. And on your far left is... Oh, microphone, yeah.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Lee Davidson. I'm a senior lecturer on the Museum and Heritage Studies program where I've been teaching for about 20 years with a specialist interest in visitor experience, international exhibitions and intercultural practice.
Kia ora koutou, ko kapu kato mahaka te maonga, ko tairi te awa, ko Ngāti Tarara toko iwi, no Otipoti aho, ko Ashley takuingoa, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So my name is Ashley. I'm a student at Victoria University of Wellington in the Museum and Heritage Studies program, currently completing my internship at the Police Museum.
Kia ora koutou, ko tararua ngā paimounga, ko ruamahanga te awa, no Wairarapa aho, kei karori tōku kāinga, ko Cherie Jacobson tōku ingoa. My name's Cherie. I'm originally from the Wairarapa, but I've spent almost as long living in Wellington now. I'm almost finished the Masters of Museum and Heritage Practice at Vic, and I've recently been doing some independent research and writing for heritage listings and working at Manatū Tonga, the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, on the Dub 100, World War 100 program, and I've just started working with the commemorations team there as well.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Samuele. I'm an international student at Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm doing my PhD, which is focused mostly on the organizational aspects of museum activity and the value of partnership and collaboration within the sector.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tahoma te Manga, ko Mississippi te Awa, ko no Wellington aho, ko Lara Simmons toko ingoa. My name is Lara Simmons, and you can probably tell from my accent I'm from the United States originally. And in my mihi, I referenced the places I lived there, which were Seattle and Minneapolis, but I now call Wellington my home. And I'm really interested in content development and interpretation in the museum sector. I'm currently working in a contract position at the Wellington City Council, and I've been doing a little bit of work on how we can get more heritage interpretation into our urban places.
So we're going to start with our first question or provocation, and Lee is going to provide a little framing around this question.
Okay, very briefly, because Robyn's already given you some context of what our aims were with this session. So on our program, we're very interested in teaching and research that helps people connect theory with practice. So we're interested in developing a kind of a reflective practice, a theory of practice, if you like, or practice theory. So to help draw that out for this panel, we asked our panellists to reflect on the connections that they have found between theory, research, and practice, and to think about how those might provide a fresh perspective on participation, protection and partnership in today's museum sector. So as Robyn said, we've divided the session into three. So we're going to start by asking each of our panellists to talk briefly about what are the principles, theories, concepts and or values that you as a professional or a researcher underpin your practice, and where have you drawn those from?
Okay, this one's on. So with my research and my practice, I drew a lot on what I learned from Conal's paper, Museums in Māori, which is a paper offered as a part of the Museum and Heritage Practice Program. I come from a background in New Zealand history, and so when going into my internship at the Police Museum, I thought a lot about what the museum was and what it involved. And I'm really a big fan of the idea of museums as a site of reconciliation and a place of partnership and healing, which is where I base most of my research on. Full disclosure, what I'm about to talk about isn't official yet. So, but what we're working on at the Police Museum is a way to practice what we preach with reconciliation and partnership, and that we wish to put together a exhibition on the Ruakinana raids in 1916, which the police were had a direct role to play in that, for those who know the story. The Police Museum is a really interesting place because it's reflective of what the police are as an organisation. And they, for example, didn't actively recruit Māori until the 1950s. So it's very much a colonised space. It's very much a European space up until reasonably recently. So getting into that research frame of mind, drawing on what we learned from museums in Māori and learning the background to a lot of grievances, particularly with the treaty, has been really fundamental to that.
I'm going to try this one. Oh, it does work now. So my background for the last 10, 12 more years is actually in theatre. So my undergrad was in theatre and English literature, and I have been a theatre maker, so a writer, a producer, a performer, you have to do everything. And I ran Bats Theatre for a few years and was part of setting up Te Awaha recently in the centre of the city, which is the new campus for Whitireia and Welltech. So I've come from quite a different background to museum and heritage studies, I think. And what's really struck me about the two is that both are, to me, essentially about storytelling and audiences, and the mysterious space between the two, which is the part that I'm really interested in, the part that we can't always control because people bring different things with them when they come to museums and heritage sites and to the theatre. And so I'm also interested in this idea of a liminal space. So a limen in Latin is apparently a threshold. So you can think of it as like a doorway or a waharoa, or the beach is a liminal space because it's not quite the sea and it's not quite the land. So it originally comes from anthropology, and it's the time during coming of age rituals where you're not quite a child and not quite an adult. So you're guided through usually a ritual, and you're open to change, and things happen to you and you react, and you come out as an adult. And so it's described as betwixt and between, full of possibility, and you're guided by someone knowledgeable. So I could see a lot of parallels between museum and heritage sites and exhibitions. Museums and heritage sites, they're both public and private. You're part of a collective, but you're having a very individual experience often. You can leave your everyday life behind and exist between past and present, and you're hopefully open to change and growth, ideally. Something that's interested me in some of the writing that I've read about this is that a lot of ritual has gone from our everyday lives. And so we could think of museums and heritage sites as places to gather and find ritual again in our everyday life. And I also really like James Clifford has written about museums as contact zones, so that reflects what Ashley was saying about places of colonial encounter, relationships and interactions across cultural borders, contact zones. So a liminal space is like a border, and a museum or a heritage site is where cultures meet on those borders. And museums once articulated the cultural high ground, but they're now sites of passage and contestation. So I'm really interested in how we can make the most of that.
I got one. Thanks. The main principles that inspired my current research mainly derive from my academic background. In particular, I've always been fascinated by a case study from my hometown in Italy. In Milan, one of the most important museums is the Pinacoteca di Brera, and one of its most famous directors, museologist and scholar Franco Russoli, some 50 years ago had this very, I would say, ambitious and utopistic vision for the future of museums. In particular, he was envisaging a cultural organization that was connected and extremely interrelated with both the social and the physical fabric of the city. He imagined an open and democratic organization that was in a constant dialogue with similar organizations within the city, like the library, the Botanic Garden, the archives, and the art academy. This experience, which, by the way, never materialized for dramatic lack of funding that characterized Italian cultural sector, made me reflect on some topics that later on became the foundation for my research. The first idea that inspired my research then is the concept of people-oriented organization. I personally think that museums have the potential to have a huge impact on people's life and to contribute to the understanding of topics such as identity, history, and cultural aspiration of human beings. And I think that to do so, museums must place people's needs at the center of their thinking. The second idea that inspires my research is the concept of relational capital, which implies that the set of relationships developed between the museum and their environment directly affect their success and their public value. These two ideas combined later on make me interpret museums as system of relationships. So to say as organization in constant dialogue with their environment and focused on the cultural well-being of people, communities, and finally society.
So during my studies with the Masters of Museum and Heritage Practices at Vic, which was last year, I really became interested in interpretation and the role that interpreters play in the museum exhibit design context. And then, so what I want to talk about today really is the overall theme of this conference and the underlying principles of the treaty, which is participation, protection, and partnership. And I want to talk about how those actually fit into the role of the interpreter. And so, you know, with participation, it's an obvious one. As an interpreter, you're aiming for your visitors to be actively participating in an exhibit design place. And there are a number of readings that I've done that have really inspired me and things that I've taken with me into my practice. And one of them was this idea of really tapping into emotion with your visitors and tapping into emotions you might not normally think to tap into, thinking about how you can make your visitors curious, thinking about how you can surprise your visitors. And Lisa Roberts, in her book From Knowledge to Narrative, really talks a lot about surprise as being something that can make content inherently memorable for visitors, and it can also incite them to want to share it with others. Another thing that, another person I've drawn from is Russell Staife and his book Reimagining Heritage Interpretation, where he really takes on Tilden's first principles and tries to bring them into the 21st century. And one of the points that he makes that I find really, really interesting is this idea that we're aiming for conversation and not persuasion, and that we can't control the visitor experience, we can only guide it. And this idea that we're trying to create shared meanings out of these places, but that we can't actually control what any person's meaning is. Each person's going to have their own experience, but we can aim for some shared experiences in the exhibit space. And when it comes to protection, I think we really need to keep in mind the power you hold as the content developer and the interpreter, and you really need to think of yourself as a guardian of the stories that are being presented. And so one thing that I find really helpful with that is thinking about whose story is it that I'm presenting, and being conscious of the power that I hold as the interpreter, and really never fooling myself into thinking that I could be truly neutral. So you really have to embrace the platform you're coming from and acknowledge that in the content development. And lastly, partnership, which is really just working to develop exhibits in conjunction with communities and looking for ways to empower others through the content, aiming for this shared meanings and multiple narratives that we can present in the exhibit design space.
So plenty to be thinking about. So find someone who is somewhere near you and share your story about one principle, theory or value that informs your practice as someone working in this space. So a quick conversation amongst you and your group. People behind you, people beside you. bring your conversations to a close. So, it's interesting, these perspectives. I love the idea of the beach, and as someone who spent a lot of my childhood growing up on the beach, watching the interference of waves running in different directions, and where the quiet water actually is an indicator of a rip that is quickly swooping someone out to the ocean. So that was a really nice image, and something that I think we need to be mindful of in terms of the capacity of museums to create change in all sorts of different ways. So our next area of focus, over to you again, Lee. Off you go.
Thank you, Robyn. Yeah, I too, I was kind of struck by the intersections between what you were all talking about in terms of the museum as what kind of space is the museum, you know, liminal space, intercultural space, a space of emotion, sharing of reconciliation and even contestation. I think that's really interesting. So the next question is perhaps the hard question, which is how do you put these ideas into practice, or how have you put this into practice through the work and the research that you're doing?
I shouldn't have given away the mic. So there's two exhibits that I've worked on that I think have some really relevant examples. The first is a visitor center that I did for the Sisters of Compassion, which are a religious congregation based out of Island Bay. And they wanted a visitor center to really tell the history of their congregation. They've been a congregation for about 125 years. And so it was really important for me in that space to think about whose story was it and think about it as the sisters' story, and to really try to help the visitor hear their voice. And I did that in a lot of ways. I did it through the use of first person in the exhibit so that people can actually imagine the sister's voice as it's coming from them. And also, when I would talk with the sisters, a lot of the times they would want the story to not be about themselves. They'd want the story to be about their foundress, Suzanne Aubert, who's in the process of sainthood, or they'd want the story to be about the Iwi of Jerusalem, which is one of the communities that they're integrally connected with. And so I couldn't ignore those things, but what I could do is I could prioritize the sister's voice in those stories. So I looked for ways that I could talk about what the sisters were doing in those stories and really bring them to the forefront of the story. Another thing that I thought was really important with the exhibition was the idea of personalizing the sister, and I had to acknowledge that the visitor would be curious about religious sisters and why would you become a sister and what the process was for becoming a sister. So we added a section to the exhibit that really talked about that, and one of the key features we included in that was the process of a sister getting her name as a sister, which is that they would, back early in the congregation, the Mother Superior would choose the name of a saint and that would be your name. So you might become Sister John or Sister Felix. Oh, most of the saints were men. So later on, then, the sisters would get to choose the names of 3 saints that they wanted as their name. And then finally, they were given the opportunity to actually go back to their birth names, and then kind of presented 2 different perspectives of Sister Felix never wanting to change her name back. She was Sister Felix, that's who she was. And another sister, Sister Annalie, being very excited about being able to go back to her birth name. So it's just about satisfying that curiosity with the visitor. Another thing was with the exhibition I worked on, Are We There Yet? Women and Equality in Aotearoa. And in that one, I really realized the power that you have as an interpreter. There was a section of the exhibit that I was working on, which we called data, where we basically put statistics about gender inequality on display with theoretically no interpretation. But really, what we were doing there is we actually had intended meanings we were hoping people would take from those statistics. So it's really important to be really clear about what was the meaning we wanted to portray, even though we were presenting it just with facts, and recognizing that not all visitors might take that meaning away, but really acknowledging that we were putting a foot forward, we were making a statement there, and really recognizing that in that space.
Thank you.
For my research, I started asking myself, what does it mean for a museum to be a system or relationship, and what are the implications of such a statement? At first, I moved from some evidence. So we do live in a highly interconnected world. Organizations are more and more specialized on their field of expertise, and many times resources are limited, if not scarce. In this perspective, partnering is widely considered one of the most effective ways to cope with such complexities. Different organizations brings together some resources for a mutual goal, for a mutual benefit. And in other words, the collaborative dimension is to some extent taking over the more traditional competitive approach. And this is even more relevant and true for organizations such as museums, whose purpose is the benefit of society rather than some profit. What then I did for my research to evaluate how this participation worked in the museum practice was to ask museum professionals about their practices and how they approach their daily work. And the data collected confirm that there is a rise in forms of collaborations and coordination within the sector, and suggest that museums at different levels are more and more leveraging on forms of relationship to reach their purposes. This data allowed me to identify different relational dimension that museums employ in their activity, and in turn I developed a framework to interpret the potential of this dimension. What the results are telling us is that to some extent we have some very developed collaborative strategies developed by museums, in particular in the connection with communities and the correlation with other museums. At the same time, there is still space for underdeveloped practice, particularly when it comes to support functions such as marketing, communication, and particularly fundraising.
Okay, so with my area of research, it's more, it's a topic that was talked about quite a lot yesterday, and the fact that we have to take on uncomfortable topics, and we have to tell the stories, as what was said yesterday, warts and all. So for the police museum, in the traditional context, there haven't been any real stories told about the police that paint them in a negative light. And for those of you who know the story of Rua Kenana in 1916, will know that the police didn't act very, very appropriately in that circumstance. And through my research, found several parallels to the Operation 8 terror raids from 2007, which won't be news to some people here. So the way we hope to do it, and how, through my own research about collaborative working with communities that you are trying to tell the story of, we're hoping to develop the exhibition around two people's development. So we aren't going to touch Tūhoi's perspective on the Rua Kenana story at all. We're going by the official stories and the police perspectives, and we hope that Tūhoi will be able to come on board and tell their story from their perspective, which means that we may approach Tūhoi with this exhibition proposal, and if they say we're not interested, it's not going to happen, and my 10,000 word document gets thrown in the bin. Which is a horrible thought for me, but it needs to happen. If we're to practice what we preach, and that we do need to work in partnership with Indigenous communities in particular, we need to be prepared to throw out our work. We need to be prepared to do that. Also, when you do work with an Indigenous community, if you are broaching difficult topics that maybe don't paint your organisation in a good light at all, you can't censor it. You have to allow those stories to come through. You can't say, oh, well, maybe leave that bit out, please, and it's just not going to work. So if we do go ahead with this this exhibition, it's currently with the police commissioner at the moment, who is in theory all for it. We haven't had a response yet. It went to his desk about a week before the Christchurch terror attack, so he's been a little bit preoccupied at the moment. But we want to be able to serve the community that the police also try and serve, and by decolonising that space, showing more stories that relate to a lot of communities they go into, it means that it can be a real site for reconciliation and healing and an acknowledgement of the wrongs, and it means that the police can also improve on their own practices as well.
So I've been really interested in the meeting between museums and theatre and heritage sites and in immersive experiences, and how they can make the most of people being in this liminal space where they're between the past and the present, and they're perhaps more open to new ideas. On both sides, there's quite a negative preconception about museum theatre, I've found. So just recently, a review of an Auckland theatre company show called the show a museum piece, and they didn't mean it in a good way. And personally, as a theatre practitioner, when someone talked about museum theatre, I thought they meant it was kind of Shakespeare done in traditional costumes with no electrical lights. It was kind of trying to recreate a museum piece. And I talked to a director of a show called Pandemic, which was a stab commission we did at BATS in 2013, where people arrived at the theatre, they thought they were going to a show, they got told someone amongst them had an infectious disease, and they had to all be put on a bus and taken to what turned out to be a 1918 flu pandemic centre. So they were surrounded by people in historic dress, and they were asked to help look after people. And the director in a radio interview said, "Oh, but I don't want this to be a piece of museum theatre." So yeah, in theatre there's this real kind of, oh no, museum theatre's not good. And then in my reading about museum theatre, I found that museum people feel the same way. But so I'm really interested in that, because on the one hand we've got this negative preconception, but on the other hand we love immersive experiences. So people who went to Pandemic, their feedback was like, wow, it was like stepping back in time. I learned so much. I learned so much more than if I'd just read a book about it. And then I'm also interested in the Quinn's post-trench experience that was at the Great War Museum, Great War exhibition. People seem to really enjoy that, and there was a lot of hype when it was released. It's like you really get to go into this trench experience. And then just the other day I came to Te Taio, which I find interesting because the tagline is "Te Papa like you've never felt it before." And people love the Earthquake House, and they've loved the Earthquake House for ages, and that's an immersive experience. So I think there is so much in common between how we make theatre and how we tell stories in museum and heritage sites, and we could be a bit more kind to each other and a bit more, we could recognise that and draw on it in a positive way. So that's what I'm really interested in looking at the moment.
Very good. So we need to be more honest but open. We need to be respectful and vulnerable if we are to do this well. And we need to understand that if someone says no, a whole pile of work might go in the bin. Yeah? So to get our egos out of the way. Lee, back to you.
Okay, so for our final part to this, the question is about, so we've talked about underpinning theories and concepts and then putting those into practice. And finally, we want to ask our panellists to talk about the outcomes of making these connections between theory, research and practice. You know, what insights from this reflection might inform the future of participation, partnership and protection in the New Zealand museum sector?
Well, I think there's a number of principles that I kind of, combining the two things, have brought forward in my future work. And one of the things that I think is really key is the idea of presenting multiple narratives and presenting more than one story. And a really key element of this is trusting your visitor. trusting them to make their own connections. You don't need to lead them every step of the way, and giving up that control of their experience to a certain extent. It's like I mentioned in my first part, it's about being their guide, but not necessarily leading them totally all the way through it. You might just point them down the right path and say, go for it. Another idea is, that we could look for ways to empower through our content. An example I have from the Auckland Museum on that is that there was a section of the Are We There Yet exhibition that had quotes of women of influence from all different times, from all over New Zealand. And there was a trans woman, JC, whose photo and quote was put up on the wall, and she happened to be on the same wall as Helen Clark. And at that moment, at the opening of the exhibition, I heard her comment to her family and friends, "Oh my God, I'm literally on the same wall as Helen Clark." And I thought that was such a really powerful thing that we brought her up to that same level, and we gave her that empowerment moment and gave other trans people that empowerment moment. And I think the other thing is to really think, as an interpreter, I think you actually really need to think through the different perspectives that other people might bring into your exhibition. So putting yourself in the role of maybe the Muslim family coming to the exhibition, or the new immigrant that's just arrived to New Zealand, and actually being conscious of that when you develop your content, and being conscious of what things they might not immediately know about the information that you're presenting. And that's, I think a really interesting thing to take forward. And then lastly, just this tapping into the human emotion and recognizing that we're all inherently human, and trying to really bring that out in the space, because that's what's going to make an experience really memorable for people.
So with, basically, this shouldn't be news to anyone here, but for me, it's the basics of being culturally aware. I'm Pākehā. I'm of Dalmatian descent. I don't have any Māori whakapapa at all. And just learning the proper way to do things is really important for me. So it means reading Ranganui Walker. It means reading a vast array of researchers who already have information out there that may be contradictory to what you learned growing up. And learning tikanga Māori as well, just being present and being willing and receptive to that. The reason why I did the disclaimer at the beginning is that it's not official yet with this, because we have to follow a very distinct process. So we're waiting on the commissioner at the moment, and then that project will then go to iwi liaison officers, who will then be solely responsible for the approach to tūhoe as an iwi. And we're not putting any time frame on that. We will be letting iwi liaison choose the appropriate time and the appropriate methods of doing that approach. Not dictating the stories that Indigenous people wish to tell about the event. So it may not be related to what we want to say, but it's not our place to say what they should be talking about. And we don't deem what is a worthy story in the eyes of Indigenous people. It comes down to really being receptive and being willing to, as Robyn said, put your ego aside, and just really being open to discussion and conversation. For example, the first time that this exhibition was sort of brought up was to Tamati Kruger and Tama Iti back in 2015, when the Police Museum and the Police College actually hosted 100 tamariki as a part of the 2014 apology. So it has been a long time coming, this sort of, this whole project. But as was talked about yesterday in regards to the Christchurch terror attack, it's all about timing, and it's all about allowing communities that space to heal before we go running in there and say we want to talk about this in a public space.
I don't have any firm outcomes yet, because I'm still exploring this, but something I'm really interested in is Andrea Whitcomb's theory of the pedagogy of feeling. So she says we've moved on from the pedagogy of walking, which is You chronologically walk along and you look at what's displayed in front of you, you receive it, and it's information from an expert. We moved into a period of pedagogy of listening, so we started to value lived experience. We introduced diverse voices telling their own stories, often through headsets. But it was still a one-way conversation, and the voices were still often framed as the other to the dominant group's narrative. So she says we've moved on from this to a pedagogy of feeling, and she's looking at tools that exhibitions use to make or encourage people to feel, reflect, and then act. And so this relates to the intersection between museums and theatre, because we can't always make an immersive experience, you know, for lots of different reasons. But we can try and use these principles of making people feel and capitalise on them being in this liminal space. And so she talks about the example of the First Peoples exhibition at Melbourne Museum and the techniques that are used to tell stories there and make people feel and reflect and then hopefully act. So they talk about a terrible gift, where we're given this gift of someone else's story, which can often be very challenging. And it's a gift, but it's also a terrible gift, because we need to do something about that and make sure it doesn't happen again and make sure things change. So the pedagogy of feeling is, how do we take people from thought to action? And it's about embodied participation. And I think theatre and museums, as I've said, there are lots of shared tools, and it would be great to look at how we're already using those and use them more to our benefit, and where we can work together more in the future as well.
Recently, I came across some very interesting body of literature from the early 80s. At the time, the debate was around the nature of museums, of museology, and their epistemology. This was a consequence of the growing number, the exponential growth in the number of museums, particularly in Western society. Therefore, academics, practitioners, and researchers started asking what museology was about. They start asking, is that a science or is it just a practice? Does it mainly deals with sociology, anthropology, history, or information science, for example? What I found interesting in this debate is that despite significant differences in the interpretation of museums and museology, what many contributors agreed on was on two main aspects of museology: its interdisciplinarity and its ongoing evolution, which in a pretty fancy way they call the historical contingency of museological thinking. In our words, as Lee suggested before, when we work in museum, we constantly practice theory, and at the same time we constantly develop a theory of practice. As a matter of fact, museums are organizations in constant evolution over time. And in this perspective, theory, practice, and research are strictly interconnected, and they mutually influence each other over time, I think, in a rather circular way. So one influences the other, and the other is developing, and then we have new practices, and you're thinking about museum. So when I think about the future of museum, when I think about possible evolution and trends, I usually imagine forms of practice that happens more and more outside the physical boundaries of museum. If we agree that museums are not the owners of their collection, but rather the guardians of such treasure on behalf of people, we have to allow for new practices to spread the scope of museum activity directly within communities. Nowadays, for example, museums are more and more engaging with topics such as growing inequalities, climate change, and multiculturalism, for example. And I really think that museum can have a huge impact on the debate over this topic. And at the same time, I think that the focus should be to remove every barrier between the message carried out by the museums and their audiences, both actual and potential audiences.
Excellent, thank you very much, panel. And fantastic to think that some of the things that we're modelling here in terms of providing an opportunity for current and recent students to remove some of the barriers between you and the sector. I wrote down here that we need to do more listening and less telling. So to put that back into your court, what I want you to do is to think about how you might use new graduates of any of the programs as assets. How would you connect with them? How would you use them as agents of change in your organisations? And whether in fact you are actively seeking out what we've described this group here as fresh eyes and inquiring minds. Just to finish off then, what I want you to do is have a brief conversation once again in your groups about one thing that you've heard from our panellists that you will be taking away with you into your work context. So a brief conversation in your groups. Do you think that's enough chatting? I'm still going for it.
I suppose so, because they can always chat later. But you're gonna do a little thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So Cherie has set up a very nice provocation that we need to feel, reflect and act. So I hope that you will join in me in expressing your feeling of gratitude for our wonderful panel. And that, like them, you will take this opportunity to reflect both on the things that you've heard, but also the work that you do on a daily basis, and take action to remove barriers, build connections, to be more culturally aware, to trust and empower others, and to enable the lives of many people to be both seen and heard, and to create waves on all sorts of beaches. So thank you very much.